Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the aftermath of World War II, learning from the Germans with Dr. Janis Gibbs. We're delighted to have you here today. We have, I think we have a full house, 70 enrolled in person, and plus people joining us virtually. I'm Randall Miller. I'm chair of the Social Sciences Committee for HASP, and we have Gloria Goodwin. Is taking care of our virtual guests joining us today. So we appreciate her help, and she'll be handling them, and they can put a notice in the chat if they have a question. And Dr. Gibbs has some natural breaks in her presentation as well for you to ask questions. Please take out your cell phones and make sure they are on silent or off. I have a new iPhone 15 Pro Max, and one time I thought I had it on silent. It said silent, and it went off anyway. So that is not a good thing to have happen. So from this point forward, I turn it off, so I don't have that occur. Let's see what else. I think that's all of the announcements for today. So please welcome Dr. Janis Gibbs. Oh, hold it. Yeah, sorry, I tied up on my introductory sheet. Let me give you her background. We do not we don't have lame presenters at Hope College for HASP. She is extremely well educated. Dr. Gibbs is an associate professor of history at Hope College, a co-advisor of the Hope College Fulbright program, a pre-law advisor, and a regular faculty member of the Hope College Vienna Summer School. Her research concentrates on 16th century Germany. So we're delighted that she's willing to do this modern topic today. She earned a JD from the University of Chicago Law School and an MA and a PhD from the University of Virginia. Now, please welcome Dr. Gibbs.
Oh, green light. All right. Thank you all for coming. It's good to see you all. I know some of you, and I'm delighted to see everybody. I feel a little bit under false pretenses because, as Randall just said, I'm not a modern Germanist. I'm an early modern Germanist. And for those of you who wonder what in the world that means, early modern is basically late 15th century up until the French Revolution. So not my normal home to be talking about the Nazis, but you can't be a German historian without talking about the Nazis. And we joke that we could, for any class, no matter what period, we could double our enrollment by saying "and the Nazis." So, which I've never done it, but that's the theory. Today, the basis of my talk is a very interesting book by Susan Neiman, Learning from the Germans, Race and the Memory of Evil. Neiman is a philosopher. This is another reason why I'm sailing under false pretenses, not a modernist, not a philosopher. She grew up was born and grew up in the South in the United States. She's American, grew up in Atlanta, and was educated at Harvard and lived for a while in Israel. She's Jewish, and she moved for a while to live in Israel. And then she was offered a job in Germany. Her dissertation research had been done, she did it in Germany, and she was invited back to be the director of the Einstein Institute in Berlin. And she has lived in Berlin now as an expat American / Israeli for several decades. And she wrote this book about learning from the Germans. And I know some of you have probably read it, but some of you may not have. And I've tried to not just summarize the book. So if you've read it, I hope you won't be bored. And if you haven't read it, I hope you'll get a flavor for the book, because this is kind of a riff on the book rather than just a summary of the book or a reaction to it. So the question that Neiman asks at the beginning of the book is how have Germans dealt with their Nazi past? And what can we as Americans learn about dealing with our problematic past from thinking about observing how the Germans have dealt with theirs? And I would say at the beginning that the Germans had some help dealing with their Nazi past because they were defeated in World War II. And the destruction of Nazi images began by the Allies. This is a short video, and there's an explosion. It doesn't come right away. The American forces blew up the swastika at the stadium in Nuremberg. If you've seen any old Nazi video, right? You've seen the rallies in Nuremberg and the torchlight parades and all this state. This is where all that took place. And the American army blew up this swastika on the stadium in April of 45. Just short audio-visual supplement. But they also, the Americans weren't the only one that helped. The Soviets helped too. This is the Soviets blowing up the Reich Chancellery building. So basically the heart of the German government in Berlin in 49.
This is Hitler's Reich Chancellery, once the nerve center of Nazism. From here, Hitler ordered the enslavement of the world. From this balcony, he received the cheers of Berliners as he announced his plans and their first successes. Now the Russians plant dynamite in the 6-foot walls, which once protected Nazidom's grate. Berlin's last major Nazi symbol is doomed. Like Nazi Germany itself, the house that Hitler built lies in ruins.
So, some of the decisions, all right, where's my cursor? I can't find the cursor. There it is. Some of the decisions the Germans made, well, some of the decisions were made for the Germans after the end of the war because the Allies blew up lots of stuff. I mean, even of course, but the bombing before the end of the war, they blew up lots of stuff. And so it wasn't as if there were lots and lots and lots of Nazi statuary that they had to decide to get rid of. And the armies of the occupation helped them with that. The heart of, isn't it, oops, one. The heart of the book, the heart of Neiman's book is this German concept of Vergangenheitsbewältigung. Actually, I put in an extra syllable. I've been doing it the whole time. Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung. I put in an extra syllable before, you maybe didn't notice. And Vergangenheit is the past, right? Vergangenheit. And Aufarbeitung is working through something. So Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung is working through the past. And it's a specific concept in German. And Germans think a lot about how they deal with their past, how they do Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung. I did it again, Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung. And one of the things that we're going to talk about is how they did that and whether and if that concept could apply to the United States. Isn't that a wonderful word? You got to just admire it. So when I read the book, I was captured by this sentence. As the slow progress of German Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung shows, public post-war expressions of Nazi sentiment were legally unacceptable. By the 1980s, they were socially unacceptable. Now most people find them morally unacceptable. And what I take from this is that Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung, it doesn't happen all at once. It's not flipping a switch. It takes time, it takes consideration, And sometimes it takes generational change. So what I tried to do is structure my talk around this idea of legally unacceptable, socially unacceptable, and morally unacceptable. And this is where the fact that I'm not a modernist and I'm not a philosopher, that's okay because I'm a lawyer. And, and so my presentation is a little bit skewed to the part that made the most sense to me. And I think you'll notice that. So the first thing that Neiman says is that the Germans made Nazism legally unacceptable. And they had some help with that too, right? The 1949 Constitution of Germany was written with great help from the Allies, from the Western Allies. But Section 86 of the German Criminal Code prohibits the means of dissemination of propaganda of unconstitutional organizations. And 86A prohibits the use of symbols of unconstitutional organizations. You notice they didn't say the Nazi Party. That's what they meant. Okay? But they also meant the communists. Because by 1949, right, we've got the Soviets in the East and the French and the Brits and the Americans in the West, and the Cold War is getting into full swing. And so in the West, they're not only worried about ex-Nazis, they're worried about communists. And what's unconstitutional about the Nazis and the communists is that they're not committed to the democratic constitution. Right? That's what makes them unconstitutional organizations. And it's true of both neo-Nazis or ex-Nazis, and it's true of the communists. And so they didn't mention specific organizations, but there are German Supreme Court cases about this that say this clearly does apply to Nazi propaganda and Nazi symbols, as well as communist propaganda and communist symbols. So things like swastika flags, you can't have them in Germany. Until very recently, you couldn't buy a copy of Mein Kampf in Germany, Hitler's book Mein Kampf, except on American Army bases. American law applies, right? On American Army bases. So the Germans set up a legal structure that disadvantaged Nazi ideas and Nazi symbols. So they're not going to make a big statue, right, with a swastika on it anymore. It's not legal. Did they have people that still thought the Nazis were peachy keen? You bet. People didn't abandon their ideas and their beliefs just because Germany was defeated in the war. But you had to be careful what you did and what you said in public. A little bit later, they added a provision to the German Criminal Code that prohibited incitement to hatred. And I should say, all of these long, wordy slides, it's all on the handouts, because if you're like me, I don't want to squint and read that. So the long quotations, they're all on your handouts. Whosoever in a manner capable of disturbing the public peace incites hatred against a national, religious, racial group or a group defined by their ethnic origins, against segments of the population or individuals because of their belonging to one of the aforementioned groups or segments of the population, or calls for violent or arbitrary measures against them, so no riots, or assaults the human dignity of others by insulting, maliciously maligning an aforementioned group, segments of the population or individuals because of their belonging to one of the aforementioned groups or segments of the population, or defaming segments of the population, shall be liable to imprisonment from 3 months to 5 years. And among other things, this makes anti-Semitism a crime, right? Also, hatred or violence against the Roma people, what are formerly called gypsies, that's considered a racially derogatory slur now. What the people themselves prefer to be called is Roma. And so the Roma people, it would include them. So any group. You can't say ugly things or incite violence against specific racial, ethnic, or religious groups. Furthermore, now we actually do start mentioning the Nazis. This is still the incitement to hatred provision. Whosoever publicly or in a meeting approves of or denies or downplays an act committed under the rule of National Socialism of the kind indicated in section 6.1 of the Code of the International Criminal Law in a manner capable of disturbing the public peace shall be liable to imprisonment not exceeding 5 years or a fine. Section 6.1 of the Code of International Criminal Law, that's the anti-genocide provision. So what this segment of the German criminal law makes illegal is denying the Holocaust. Whoever publicly or in a meeting disturbs the public peace in a manner which violates the dignity of the victims by approving of or glorifying or justifying National Socialist tyranny and arbitrary rule incurs a penalty of imprisonment for a term not exceeding 3 years or a fine. So you can't be pro-Nazi, right? It's against German criminal law to be pro-Nazi. The Germans, over a period of years, starting right at the beginning of Germany after the war, has limited political expression, has limited speech, all in the interest of forbidding or preventing the rise of fascism and not incidentally communism again. So rendering things legally unacceptable. I have to say, this Holocaust denial thing, not everybody thinks that making Holocaust denial illegal is a good idea. It's illegal in a lot of countries. It's not only illegal in Germany, it's illegal in France, for example. And there's a whole list of countries where Holocaust denial is illegal. You couldn't make it illegal in the United States because of the First Amendment, right? We can't do that here. But this is Deborah Lipstadt. She's a renowned historian and currently United States Special Envoy for monitoring and combating anti-Semitism in the Biden administration. And she got really famous for her 1993 book, Denying the Holocaust, The Growing Assault on Truth and Memory. So she's basically a scholarly and practical expert on anti-Semitism. And she works for the American government to work against anti-Semitism. And she thinks that Holocaust denial laws are a really bad idea. And she thinks so, I'm not going to read this one, I'm just going to summarize it, because she believes in the First Amendment, like she's straight up American. And even though she got sued by a British Holocaust denier who said that she wasn't telling the truth about him, and she won, it was very expensive, but she won the suit. And that's part of the reason, her commitment to the First Amendment. But she also says it just doesn't work. Forget the morality. I think that these laws turn whatever is being outlawed into forbidden fruit. We saw it in Germany when Mein Kampf was released from the embargo on it a few years ago. People bought it because suddenly it was something they could get a hold of. I just don't think these laws work. And the third reason I'm opposed to them is I don't want politicians making a decision of what can and cannot be said. That scares me enormously. So the Germans have done things that a lot of Americans, Deborah Lipstadt among them, say that's just not going to fly. It's not a good idea. But the Germans have embraced this first we make it illegal. And they've done it across a broad range of things. The idea of making things legally unacceptable still goes on today, right? This is a proposed German citizenship law in 2023 forbidding the naturalization of anyone who has committed an anti-Semitic act. So they don't, you can think whatever you want in your head, but if you do anything about it, right, they can bar you from German citizenship. And that's actually kind of important because Germany used to be, until just recently, until like last year, this year, a place where citizenship really depended on your German blood. I've heard people say, most people don't find their great-grandfather's SS documents useful things. Like, they don't really want to show those to people. But if you wanted a German passport, you could get one with that because the SS really cared about your good German roots, and they did a whole lot of genealogy to prove that you were really German. And if you had your great-grandfather's SS documentation, you could probably get a German passport. But the Germans are busy right now in 2024 expanding the ability to get German citizenship, but they don't want everybody, nobody who commits anti-Semitic acts. So this was from an article in Reuters in October of 23, but the law just passed in January. The new citizenship law just passed in January. And this is this quotation's from a translation, official translation of the website of the German government. It is clearly established that anti-Semitism, racism, and other forms of disrespect for human beings are incompatible with a guarantee of human dignity enshrined in the basic law, that's the German Constitution, and are grounds for exclusion from the option to acquire citizenship. So that is almost the law in Germany. Bundestag has passed it. The chancellor has to sign it. So the requirements for naturalization have been extended to include commitment to Germany's particular historic responsibility for the National Socialist dictatorship and its consequences, and in particular, the protection of Jewish life and peaceful coexistence of nations, as well as the ban on offensive warfare of the modernization of the citizenship law, section so-and-so of the modernization of the citizenship law. So if you're going to become a naturalized citizen of Germany, you have to buy into Germany's historic responsibility for Nazism, even though you weren't German when it happened, right? If you're going to become German, you buy into all of it. You get the good stuff, you get the bad stuff. So Germany's pretty serious about recognizing responsibility for the acknowledgement of German responsibility, not your individual personal responsibility, but acknowledgement of Germany's responsibility for the Nazi period, for the Holocaust. And if you want to be German, you have to accept that too. So again, using the law, even up to this year, for their Vergangenheitsbewältigung. I just like saying it. But how are we doing on time? Not everybody jumped on the Vergangenheitsbewältigung bandwagon. How's that? The Vergangenheitsbewältigung bandwagon right away. In fact, in the years immediately following the war, the late 40s, the 50s, people didn't want to talk about it. They didn't want to talk about it at all. And the apple cart really got upset by the student movement in the 60s. 68 was a heck of a year everywhere, right? It was a heck of a year in the United States. It was a heck of a year in Europe. And there was a big German student movement in 68. And among other things, they protested the Vietnam War. A lot of the pictures that I found were all about Vietnam and Lyndon Johnson. But I didn't really want one of those pictures. I wanted one that was more about German. But look at the English language sign, the sign on the left. We make reforms, not revolution. People got a sign in English. But besides their opposition to the Vietnam War, the students in Germany in the 60s, they demanded discussion of Germany's past, things their parents and their grandparents didn't want to talk about. They wanted to talk about the number of ex-Nazis in important government positions in the Federal Republic in West Germany, because the Federal Republic, by the early 50s, were way more worried about the communists than they were worried about the ex-Nazis, and they needed some experienced bureaucrats to run the country. And if they had swastikas in their past, who really cared anymore? So there were lots of ex-Nazis in the government in Germany. And they challenged this silence that had prevailed in Germany. And so the people who had lived through the Third Reich were not particularly interested in Vergangenheitsbewältigung. Like, enough already, we did it. and for some of them, what was so bad about it anyway? And for others, it was time for a moral and historical reckoning, according to the young people. I gotta flog a movie. This is a fabulous movie. It's in German. I don't know if the DVD just has subtitles or is dubbed. It's called The Nasty Girl. And it's based on a true story. And I've got there's a reference to it on the last page of your handout. Based on the story of Anna Rosmus, who as a late teenager, 16, 17, decided to do some research on what had happened in her town in Passau during the Nazi era, and which nobody talked about. And what she found out was that all these people, solid citizens, businessmen, mayors, members of the city council, they'd been Nazis. And they were Nazis early. It wasn't like they joined in 42 when they had to because the war was on and they might get arrested. Actually, they didn't really much arrest people for not being members of the party, but it did help you in your career advancement. But these were guys who joined before it helped them in their careers. And her community went nuts. Like, they didn't want her to do this. She had to get court orders to get access to archives. She and her family were harassed. And she ended up with this book, Resistance and Persecution, the Case of Passau, 1933 to 39. It's set in the 80s. It's a really, really good movie. And it is available to stream on Amazon Prime. And they have the DVD in Van Wylen Library. If you have a Hope Library card, you can get it there. I actually didn't look at Herrick. You might be able to get it for you at Herrick too. But you can stream it on Amazon. So it's a fictionalized version of a true story about challenging the silence, about making, about Vergangenheitsbewältigung, and if you're going to make it socially unacceptable to be a Nazi, you can't just do it by silence. You have to face it and choose to make it socially unacceptable. And I really like the movie, so there's my plug for the movie. You also need to make the sins of the past visible. Alongside not making great big Nazi memorials, you memorialize other things. And this is the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe. It's in Berlin, and it's fairly recent. I actually didn't look up the year, 1990s maybe. It's a fairly recent memorial. It wasn't there when I was in Berlin in 92, so maybe it's later than that. And it's right there in the heart of Berlin, so that the visible memorial to the millions of people killed during the Nazi era is right there in the heart of the city. So making the sins of the past visible by choosing to memorialize the victims of the Holocaust and not the Nazis who built the Third Reich. This is another one, and these I have seen. These are really remarkable. These are Stolpersteine. Has anybody been to Europe and seen the Stolpersteine? You've done? Yeah, aren't they remarkable? They're these little brass plaques that people put in the street. And since a lot of the streets are cobblestone, it's pretty easy. You can just take out a stone and you put in this Stolperstein, this stumbling stone. And they go in front of the last known freely chosen residents of people that were deported and killed by the Nazis. And they're a grassroots sponsored decentralized movement. It's not sponsored by the government. It was started by one guy. He's got some help now because there's like about 70,000 of them and he couldn't make them all by himself. They still make them all by hand. And it costs about 120 euros to have one, to make it, to get it installed. And usually people in the neighborhood or people in the community sponsor the stone, and if they can find the family, they check with the family. And so you see them sometimes. Sometimes lots of them. It's a big apartment building, and there were lots of Jews deported from the apartment building. Sometimes there's lots of them in front of a building, And these ones, the top line is hier wohnte, here lived, and then the name. This is a married couple, Jakob Honig and Elisabeth Honig. And this looks to me like it's got to be in, at least she was Hungarian, because Elizabeth is Elizabeth in Hungarian. It shows where they were born, or when they were born, and what year, and then if they know when the person was deported. And then the last line on both of these says fate unknown, Schicksal unbekannt. They don't know what happened to these people. They haven't found them in the records. There are lots of Nazi records. You can find out what happened to lots of people, but not all of them. So the Stolperstein are really remarkable. And that is really a popular movement of memorialization. It's not done by a government. It's not done by a big foundation. It's not done by rich people. It's done by ordinary people who want to commemorate this. And I think this is really emblematic of the ways that Germany has succeeded in making the working through of the past and the glorification of the Nazis socially unacceptable, right? We're going to commemorate not just the fact that 6 million people were killed, we're going to commemorate the individuals to the extent that we can find them. It's a really human scale memorial. And it's popular. I mean, in terms of driven by the people. So I'm going to stop here before we move on and see if anybody's got questions about the German part, because I'm going to shift to America. Yeah. We've got to go. We've got a microphone, I think.
It's kind of implied in your presentation, but I've always been curious, what do they teach in their schools to their kids? Do they gloss over World War II, or do they make a point of?
Oh, they glossed over it in the 40s and the 50s, and they changed all the curriculum after 68.
So they do cover it, and they're
oh yeah,
pretty honest about
oh yeah,
the role. Okay.
they are honest about it. They now, most students are required to do a field trip to one of the concentration camps at some point in their education. And so they've done a pretty good job of including a pretty fair account of the Third Reich in the schools. But that wasn't true in the 40s and the 50s. Yeah.
On the incitement to hatred, it talks about racial and religious and so forth, but no mention of LGBTQ individuals. Is there any, where does that stand in Germany? I mean, are they allowed, German citizens allowed to mistreat in any way, shape, or form individuals because of their sexual orientation?
That's a good question. I actually don't know the answer to that, but my impression is that that is not a huge problem in Germany. I mean, it was during the Third Reich, right? LGBTQ people were also put in concentration camps, but it's not a huge issue in Germany now. The Weimar Republic, for example, before the Nazis, was like a hotbed of open sexual mores. I had a student several years ago who wrote a wonderful paper about the body in Weimar Germany that included a whole section on basically gay nightclubs in Berlin. So the Germans have never had the kind of visceral problem with that sometimes we see in the United States. So I don't know the answer to the question. I may have to now go home and look, but I don't know.
This is about the new business of qualifying for citizenship.
Yeah.
As I'm reading the slide, I'm wondering if this can also apply to Muslims who are currently emigrating, sometimes legally, sometimes not, into Germany and Europe in general, but I know that there are any number of them in Germany proper.
Yeah.
And so if they were, if they had been speaking or somehow identifying some hostility toward Israel and current Jews, that would then make any application for German citizenship null and void, would it not?
Well, I mean, two things about that. The first thing is that not all opposition to Israeli politics is anti-Semitism, right? Some people are opposed to Israel because they're anti-Semitic, but some people are opposed to Israel for perfectly legit political reasons. I mean, to Israeli actions as opposed to the existence of Israel. And I mean, I think we'd be judged like anybody else. I don't think that Muslims are per se excluded because of the fact that Muslim states are at war with Israel. It would require an anti-Semitic action, not merely a belief, on the part of any individual person. And in that case, a person could be excluded, but not merely by virtue of being Muslim. In fact, there's a huge Muslim population in Germany. Germany imported many Turkish guest workers who have lived in Germany for decades now. And for a long time, no matter, even if the children of guest workers were born in Germany, they weren't German citizens because they weren't German by blood. And it was a huge problem because these kids grew up in Germany. They'd never been to Turkey, but they were, according to the German government, Turks. So it's going to solve their problem about people who have lived in Germany for decades but haven't been able to get German citizenship. So I think that Muslims are excluded for anti-Semitism to the exact same degree that anybody else is. I don't think there's a specific rule that if you're Muslim and opposed to Israel, you're anti-Semitic. Does that make sense?
I spent time in West Berlin in 1967,
Whoa.
and I was interested in how the people had reacted to the war. And every time I would bring up the conversation, they only focused on the fact that I was American, and that they wanted to talk about how wonderful America was in helping to feed the people in West Berlin.
Yeah, well, I mean, Berlin, of course, was especially saved by the Berlin airlift, right, during the late 40s when the Soviets blockaded Berlin. So yeah, and before 68, that's still the I don't want to talk about a generation. Yeah.
So Diet Amann was hired to teach this history in Germany. She was a Grand Rapids resident, but a Dutch resistance fighter. Do you know anything about her and this mission to educate?
This is a really easy answer. No, I don't. I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. I just don't know. Other questions? Should we? I'll move along, and there'll be more opportunities at the end if you think of questions. Okay. So the book is really in three parts. The first part is the section about Germany and how they worked through their past. And the second section is about the way America has failed in many ways to work through its past. And there's whole big long sections about Emmett Till. Neiman, the author, spent a year living in Mississippi, working at an Institute for Racial Reconciliation at the University of Mississippi, and told some wonderful stories about her experience living in the South and talking to both Black and white Southerners about how they understand the American past with respect to race. So what can Americans learn from the Germans? Well, we certainly have a problematic history, right? We have a problematic history involving slavery. We have a problematic history even after slavery involving racial discrimination. And we could again talk about legal acceptability and social acceptability and moral acceptability, and about the way we understand our own past. And just like the line about legally and socially and morally grabbed me, this one grabbed me too. Stored in some German attics are boxes of carefully wrapped china decorated with swastikas. But Southern homes display their Confederate memorabilia proudly, and Southern stores make considerable profits selling it. And the only thing that I would correct about that is it's not just Southern stores. And the picture, I went looking because, oh my gosh, some of this stuff, it's hard to find a decent picture for. I went looking for a picture. I wanted like a Confederate memorabilia shop, and I didn't find any really good evocative pictures, but this is an online store. Welcome to Confederate Shop. Explore our unique selection of Confederate paraphernalia. All Confederate, all the time, no apologies. And this is not like, it doesn't matter where you live, you can order this from any place. So you can't buy a Nazi flag in Germany, but you sure can buy a Confederate battle flag in the United States. So we don't have quite the start that the Germans had at getting rid of the symbols of our problematic past. You heard in my bio, I went to the University of Virginia, Charlottesville, for my master's and PhD. And I hadn't, and what doesn't say in my bio is I went to College of William and Mary, also in Virginia, for my undergrad, even though I didn't grow up in Virginia. I have maybe the world record for paying out-of-state tuition at Virginia universities. And I went back this spring break to Charlottesville for the first time in 28 years. I hadn't been back since I got my PhD in 1996. I went back this last week over spring break, and it's lots bigger than it used to be. And the Lee statue's gone. You probably remember that, right? The removal of the Lee statue and the proposed removal of the Lee statue in 2017 was the genesis of the Unite the Right, demonstration that turned bloody and resulted in the death of Heather Heyer, who was hit by a car on purpose during the demonstration. And that's Lee before all the before all the recent unpleasantness. He's gone now. The picture on the right was taken by my doctoral advisor from his window as they removed Robert E. Lee on a truck going down the street. So there's Lee on Traveler heading for a warehouse someplace. But this problematic thing about what we choose to memorialize is a persistent thing. And it's come up especially since 2020, right? Since the murder of George Floyd and the demonstrations after that, there's been a lot of movement to remove Confederate memorials. And one of the things about the Confederate memorials that I think a lot of people don't know is that these didn't go up right after the war. These went up right around the turn of the 19th to the 20th century after Reconstruction, when white people were reasserting their power after the attempt at integrating Black people into citizenship. And the Reconstruction ended and the South wasn't occupied anymore. And the Southern white folks said, okay, let's make it like it was. And built lots of these Confederate memorials. And then there was another blast of it in the 50s and the 60s in opposition to the civil rights movement. So these are not so much memorials to the greatness of the Confederacy as they're statements of continuing commitment to the ideas of the Confederacy. And that's why they're a problem. So I also went to Richmond. This isn't there anymore either. It's in a museum now. This is the Jefferson Davis Memorial in Richmond on Monument Avenue. Monument Avenue is one of the ceremonial boulevards in Richmond. They had lots of Confederate statues on it. This one was unveiled on Jeff Davis's birthday, June 3rd in 1907. So turn of the century, right when they were doing the reaction against Reconstruction. In the South, Jeff Davis's birthday is sometimes considered Confederate Memorial Day. What's that about? And its example, the colonnade, the columns are the states that seceded. And it's an example of this lost cause mythology. Do you know about the lost cause? This idea that the South was a genteel society, and it was gracious, and it was a lovely place to live, and it was all destroyed by those evil northern industrialists, right? And if you watch I actually don't have a slide for this one, right? Gone with the Wind. Gone with the Wind is a lost cause book, right? Of sorrow for the gentility of the Confederacy. And the Southern states really won the battle for the narrative in the early part of the late 19th and early 20th century. When you were in school and you learned about the Civil War, there are a lot of names for it. What did they call the Civil War when you were in school? I'm hearing Civil War. I'm hearing war between the states. War of Northern Aggression. I didn't hear that one until I moved to Virginia to go to college. But I did hear that one. And anybody ever hear it called the War of the Rebellion? The official document in the Library of Congress and collections, we have them here in the library at Hope, called the official documents of the War of the Rebellion. It's both Confederate documents and Union documents. My colleague Fred Johnson assigns his students to write papers based on the official documents of the War of the Rebellion all the time. But nobody calls it the War of the Rebellion anymore. Because if it's the War of the Rebellion, then the Confederates are traitors. And if it's a war between the states, it's just a little disagreement, don't you know? So when I say that the South won the narrative, I really mean the South won the narrative. And the newspaper article about the installation of the Jeff Davis Monument from Richmond, the entire monument typifies the vindication of Mr. Davis and the cause of the Confederacy for which he stood before the world. 1907, the vindication of the cause of the Confederacy. I think we're in need of some Vergangenheitsbewältigung. How about you? The monument was pulled down in 2020 in the protests following the death of George Floyd, and it is now displayed in the Valentine Museum in Richmond, which alas, I didn't get to see, but it's displayed horizontal, like the way it fell, and covered with spray paint, because they're talking about the change in the attitude about the monuments in Richmond. Yeah. Questions?
Just to point out how pervasive this was, I'm from Virginia. And I went to Robert E. Lee Elementary School.
Mhm.
I went to Stonewall Jackson Middle School.
Yeah.
And the university where I attended, which was founded in about 1907. So during the Jim Crow era is when it saw its development. And recently, just about half the buildings on the campus had to be renamed because they were celebrating those who were very active in the Confederacy.
Right.
So during that Jim Crow era, and when I was in middle school, we'd go to Richmond for school trips, and we'd go down Monument and Avenue. That was one of the highlights of the school trip, was to go down Monument Avenue. So it was so pervasive in terms of built into your, not just monuments, but if you think of schools and colleges as monuments, and even school tours, which kind of reinforce that,
Right.
just how pervasive it was.
Right. You're touring Monument Avenue, not a concentration camp, right? Yeah, we have some Vergangenheitsbewältigung to do here. A friend of mine is can you believe it? She's a self-employed historian. She runs a business called History Matters that does historical research, lots of times for historic preservation, right? If people want historic preservation tax credits. But among other things, she's worked for school districts who want her to research the names of their school buildings to see if anything is creepy in there that they need to change. And there are a lot of creepy things that they need to change. And she lives in Richmond. I went to visit her. That's her there. So she's done a lot of this work about Vergangenheitsbewältigung. How do we understand the Civil War? You probably saw this one, right?
What was the cause of the United States Civil War?
Well, don't come with an easy question or anything. I mean, I think the cause of the Civil War was basically how government was going to run, the freedoms and what people could and couldn't do. What do you think the cause of the Civil War was? I'm sorry?
This is what happened when somebody's not mic'd.
I mean, I think it always comes down to the role of government and what the rights of the people are. And I will always stand by the fact that I think government was intended to secure the rights and freedoms of the people. It was never meant to be all things to all people. Government doesn't need to tell you how to live your life. They don't need to tell you what you can and can't do. They don't need to be a part of your life. They need to make sure that you have freedom. We need to have capitalism. We need to have economic freedom. We need to make sure that we do all things so that individuals have the liberties so that they can have freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom to do or be anything they want to be without government getting in the way.
So, okay. You notice the word she didn't say.
What do you want me to say about slavery?
She didn't say slavery. And if it's about the freedom, or it's about what government can tell you you can or can't do, what was it that government was trying to say people couldn't do? Have slaves, right? So the quotation on the other side of the slide is from a speech by Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy. It's probably his most famous speech. It's the only one I know about anyway. It's called the Cornerstone Speech. He made it in 1861. The new Confederate Constitution has put at rest forever all the agitating questions relating to our peculiar institutions, right? The peculiar institution is always slavery. African slavery as it exists among us, the proper status of the Negro in our form of civilization. This was the immediate cause of the late rupture and present revolution. Jefferson, in his forecast, had anticipated this as the rock upon which the old Union would split. He was right. What was conjecture to him is now a realized fact, but whether he fully comprehended the great truth upon which that rock stood and stands may be doubted. In 1861, the Confederates knew what the war was about, right? The current whitewashing is such an ugly word. The current way to say, well, it wasn't about slavery, it was about states' rights, right? States' rights to do what, right? It's about slavery. You can't make it not, but we try real hard. So this is where I told you you're going to get a lawyer. And here's where you're going to get a lawyer. Because what we did at first was make racial segregation and discrimination legally acceptable in the aftermath of Reconstruction. States, especially in the South, passed Jim Crow laws that mandated segregation, right? This is the white drinking fountains and the black drinking fountains. And if you saw, if you saw the play or the movie To Kill a Mockingbird, right? It's why the African Americans are in the balcony and not on the ground floor of the courtroom. There's separation. Voting restrictions that disenfranchised African Americans. How many bubbles in a bar of soap? You can't answer that question, you can't vote, right? Or the office, the registrar's office would never be open when people came to register if those people weren't white. Convict labor, right? The 13th Amendment to the Constitution outlawed slavery except as a punishment for crime. And so for many years, the American penal system used convict labor that had an enormously disproportionate effect on African Americans. I don't mean to say white people weren't in chain gangs, they were, but disproportionate effect on African Americans. Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court case that said separate but equal is okay, right? Economic enabling of segregation, redlining, saying that you can't give mortgages or sell houses to people who aren't white in particular neighborhoods. And that's had enormous effect on economic disparity down to the present day. We enshrined, if not slavery, the principles of segregation that followed from slavery. And So if you're going to make things legally unacceptable, we got off to a pretty poor start after the Civil War. One of the things that Neiman suggests was that Reconstruction just didn't last long enough, right? The occupation of Germany lasted a whole lot longer than Reconstruction. And so they had some outside help with their legal structures for much longer than the United States did. But we did eventually get around to dismantling segregation legally. And this is also part of the aftermath of World War II. Black soldiers in the American Armed Forces in World War II talked about a double victory. A victory in the war, and then bringing their credibility as veterans, as people who had fought for the United States in the war back home to fight against segregation on the home front. And they did that. And we see in the 50s the birth and the growth of the civil rights movement in the 50s, in the 60s. So we start right after the Civil War with the legal dismantling of segregation, the post-Civil War amendments, the 13th, which abolished slavery or involuntary servitude, except for that punishment for a crime thing. The 14th Amendment provided that anyone born or naturalized in the United States was a citizen and guaranteed due process of law and equal protection of the laws to all, no matter your race or your previous condition of servitude, right? So this established that anybody born in slavery was a citizen, right? 15th Amendment guaranteed the right to vote, regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Well, lots of words, many, many words, not always enacted until much later. Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, declaring that separate but equal violated the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. Civil Rights Act of 1964. This stuff is younger than I am. Civil Rights Act of 1964, prohibiting discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, prohibiting discriminatory limitations on voting and instituting a system that required what they called pre-clearance. If you were from a state that had a history of systematic voter discrimination, if you wanted to change your voting laws, you had to run them by the court, the federal courts first. And that lasted until the last decade, when the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act in Shelby County v. Holder and said, yeah, Civil War is a long time ago. We don't have to have pre-clearance anymore. Everything will be fine. And we know that it's not, because there's been a whole huge wave of voter suppression since Shelby County. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg said that getting rid of the pre-clearance provisions was like saying, well, I have this, it's raining outside, and I have this umbrella and I'm dry, so I'm gonna get rid of the umbrella and I won't get wet. And then, of course, the Fair Housing Act of 68, prohibiting discrimination in real estate rental or sales, mortgage lending, home improvement. So we're trying to make the legal structures match our aspirations. Not there yet, but we're trying. If we don't do Confederate memorials, what do we memorialize? Well, this one, I haven't seen this one. This is fairly new, only opened in 2018. The National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama, the National Lynching Memorial. And those tablets symbolize every county in the United States where a documented lynching took place. And it's on my list. I want to go there. I have never seen it. It's supposed to be really remarkable. And they also have, from each place where they've been able to identify a place of a lynching, a jar with earth from each place. And Neiman talks about the colors. She said, it's stunningly beautiful. She said, I grew up in Georgia, where if you saw Gone with the Wind, you know that Georgia has red earth, right? But she said that the jars with the earth tone colors of all the places, she said it was so beautiful it made her uncomfortable, because should a memorial that's supposed to make you think about lynching be that gorgeous? But stuck with her. So we choose what we memorialize. I was in, as I said, Richmond last week, And Richmond had a big slave market. There is no memorial to the Richmond slave market, but Richmond has a Holocaust museum. So we choose. And how do we deal with the injustices of the past? Well, the Germans paid millions of dollars in reparations. They paid reparations to the state of Israel as compensation and resettlement money. The Germans were they don't like to call it reparations because that brings up the Treaty of Versailles. Remember, in the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was required to pay reparations to France and Britain, and Germans are a little nervous about the word reparations. So they call it compensation and resettlement money because there were thousands and thousands and thousands of Jewish refugees, many of whom landed in Israel after the war. And Israel really did have a problem, like providing for all these sick people who were immigrating. And so big funds, also additional millions paid to the World Jewish Congress. In the 1990s, Germany, remember German reunification, 89, 90, right? There's a question, what do you do with all the people who fled the East when the communists took over and there was the barriers and the Berlin Wall and the two Germanys and people fled? And Germany established a trust fund to pay people who had fled the East for the value of their property. They didn't give it back to them because the East Germans who'd been living there for decades, like, what are you going to do with them? They're not going to put them out. So people didn't get their property back always, but they got the value or some measure of the value of the property. And we've also seen claims for restoration for looted works of art. So there's all kinds of ways that we're dealing with the aftermath of World War II in pretty concrete financial terms. Anybody seen the movie? There's a movie about this one too, right? The Woman in Gold, the portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer, which I saw before it was returned. So I saw it in Vienna when it was held by the Belvedere. It was owned by a Jewish family in Vienna, and Adele, the woman in the painting, she died before the Nazi takeover, and she said, although the painting actually belonged to her husband, it was her wish that it be given to the Austrian government to be displayed, publicly displayed. But then there's the Anschluss, and Germany and Austria are united, and Ferdinand Bloch-Bauer fled and left all his possessions behind him because that's what you had to do when you fled. And the German government got the painting. They stole the painting, basically. And they gave it to the Galerie Belvedere in Vienna, where it remained until 2006. Meanwhile, Ferdinand Bloch-Bauer died, and his niece sued the gallery, charging that the painting should be stolen from her family. And the Austrian government, which is the successor, right, that owns the Belvedere now, the Austrian government said, well, your aunt said that it should go to the German government, and we're the successor, and she really wanted it to go to Austria. And the niece said, you killed 6 million Jews. I don't think my aunt would have given you the painting. And she sued in the American courts, and the Supreme Court recognized her claim. And although there was a settlement after the recognition of the claim, she was awarded the painting along with some other looted artworks, and she sold it immediately. And don't think she was, it's not like she's just a pig for money. Can you imagine what it would cost to insure that puppy if you owned it? Like, she couldn't afford to keep it. So she sold it to Ronald Lauder, the cosmetics area, like Estee Lauder, and 135 million. And it's now hanging in New York City in the Neue Galerie, which does modern German and Austrian painting. And anybody gone to New York and seen it there? I haven't. Yeah. So it's in New York now. And that's only one example of restoration of looted artwork. And there's a lot of that going on now, and has been for the past 10 or 20 years. In the United States, there are big discussions about reparations. And I'm not going to talk about all the details. That would, you should have another session on reparations. I'm not going to do all of that, but I'm going to give you some examples. Georgetown University and the Jesuits, Society of Jesus, which runs Georgetown, gave $27 million recently to the Descendants Truth and Reconciliation Foundation. And these are the descendants of 272 enslaved people who had been sold by the university in the 19th century to pay off debt. And the university, of course, had records, right? So we know who these enslaved people were. And to the extent that they've been able to find the descendants, they've established this foundation for the benefit of descendants. And Georgetown also has a free tuition program for anybody who can establish they're a descendant of a slave owned by Georgetown. So there's some private organizations that are doing work towards reparations. It's not only African Americans. The Civil Liberties Act of 1988 provided compensation to survivors of the internment of Japanese Americans during the Second World War, when the Japanese Americans were rounded up and removed from the West Coast and sent to camps in the interior. And this was a big victory in 1988, that the United States government was willing to pay reparations. It wasn't anything like what those people lost. It was about $20,000 a person. And it was only for survivors, not for their descendants. So it went to a bunch of fairly old people, right, by 1988. And that's Ronald Reagan signing the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. And so we do, in some circumstances, try to achieve justice by paying reparations. Should there be reparations for slavery? Neiman comes down heavy on the yes for that. And I'm not going to try to reconstruct her argument. It's pretty complicated. But among other things, she argues that it's not just slavery. It's the legal structure that perpetuated the segregation and the disadvantaging of the descendants of enslaved people that perpetuated all the way in, at least through the 60s. So she argues yes. And it's a more complex argument than that. And I'm going to recommend that if you want to know about that, you should set up a session on reparations, because it's too much to do in like 10 minutes. But what can we learn then from the Germans? Okay? Face our history. Don't be silent. Right? Don't not talk about it. Right? What about and I'm a history teacher, right? I look at all these proposals about not teaching anything that will upset anybody in history class. If you don't teach something that's not upsetting anybody in history class, you're not teaching history. Right? There's human beings, we do awful stuff. And the trick is to understand why and how we do it, and then what we can do better. So face our history, don't be silent, and don't try not to upset people. We need to do our own Vergangenheitsbewältigung. I knew I could say it at least once more. We have to accept responsibility for the evils of the past. It's true, we did not commit them. Right? We were not born when the United States was a slave society. We did not commit them. But we live in a society that was built on that legacy. And we need to acknowledge that. We need to move from making evil things legally unacceptable to making them socially unacceptable to making them morally unacceptable. I think we're probably there with saying that slavery is morally unacceptable, but we haven't done enough Vergangenheitsbewältigung to think about the long-standing effects of slavery and what the moral implications of that are. We're working on social unacceptability. Let's just say it's not linear. Doesn't go in one direction and never backs up. Still contested. We're still working on our Vergangenheitsbewältigung. And not everybody agrees with about how to do that. Things take time. In Germany, nobody wanted to talk about the Third Reich until the 60s. And then it took time after that. One of the things that Neiman argues was that East Germany, and this is actually pretty contested because West Germans think they did a better job at facing their past. East Germans think they did a better job at facing their past. Neiman stands with the East Germans, and she says, for example, the memorialized concentration camps were much better done in the East than in the West, where nobody really wanted to talk about it. And I can kind of vouch for that. I went to Germany for the first time in 1974 when I was in high school, and I was with a student group, and we wanted to go see Dachau. And everybody in Munich, or the travel people in Munich that we asked, like, oh, what do you want to go there for? There's nothing there. We eventually did go there. It was really striking. I have vivid memories of that. And then they had lots of interpretation, right, with newspaper photos on big bulletin boards, and Hitler's face was scratched out on all of them. So make the sins of the past visible. Choose what to memorialize. Changing what we memorialize is not the same as erasing history, right? I've heard so many people say, oh, why would you take down the statues? You're going to just erase our history. History is not the same as memorialization, right? Memorialization is what we choose to commemorate. I couldn't find it again. I saw a wonderful a cartoon with a Confederate statue and a couple people looking at it and saying, all those people who are upset about taking down the statues, they're going to be really upset when they find out about books. So you're not going to erase the past if you change what you memorialize. And take steps toward justice. And we're still trying to think about what it means in the United States to take steps toward justice. And we should. Vergangenheitsbewältigung is not a switch. We don't flip it and we're done. It's the work of many lifetimes, and it's our work. That's all I got. Thank you.
Questions?
I have
Here we go.
one comment about what we are beginning to do in our acknowledgement of the indigenous peoples before the slavery.
Yes. Yes, we haven't done our, am I still on? We haven't done our Vergangenheitsbewältigung about that at all. The relationship between the United States and the indigenous peoples is, how can we say this, more shameful than not? And we haven't even begun to do that. I mean, in terms of again, in terms of what we're taught in the schools, we do a better job, even though we've established that we don't do such a great job on the Civil War. I think we do a worse job on the indigenous people.
We went to a Hope College event in the Miller Center a couple of months ago, and there was an acknowledgement that the land upon which the Miller Center stands was taken from indigenous people. And that was, to me, the first time there was an acknowledgement of indigenous people being displaced from the Holland area and being sent to other places. And then the indigenous people came back, they were never able to reclaim their space.
Yes, that's true. The theater department does land acknowledgements too. If you've gone to a Hope Theater production, there's always a land acknowledgement at the beginning. It's a start. It's an acknowledgement, right? It's a step on the road to justice.
Thank you for going well beyond Susan Neiman's book. I appreciate all the energy that you put into your preparation. And before we leave, I just wanted to mention Ralph Fairbanks is here, and he is available to take your photograph if you haven't had it taken for the HASP directory. Other questions?
This is not really a question, but in 1958, a Southern farmer said, I want to have some of those Northern guys come down and hunt quail. My dad said, let's go. And here I'm from a farm in Illinois. So I started talking to the guy one night and I said, we're here in Oxford, Mississippi. Oh, has a black man ever gone to university? I'm going to have to use a bad word. He looked at me and he says, well, one tried back in 1956, but any nigger that's stupid enough to go that route and apply must be crazy. So we put him in a mental institution. I came back and researched it. Absolutely true. That little farm boy was cheering when in 1962, the first black was admitted by having his hand held by Bobby Kennedy to get into
Yeah.
Ole Miss. I've felt that ever since, and I have worked totally the other way. That's not going to be any part of my life. I'm going to do what I can to make sure that they have every break.
Yeah, you know, if you want to know more about that, Neiman talks about that because she was at Ole Miss in Oxford for her year of study, and she interviewed the man who was the first African American to go to Ole Miss. Yeah, I see James Meredith. Yeah, she interviewed him, and apparently, he at one point had a discussion with the governor of Mississippi, who said, can't you just say you wanted to do this for the education? And Meredith said, I had an education. I'd have to have been crazy to do this for an education. This is not why I did it, right? I did it to make a point. So he had a college degree already from a traditionally African-American school.
What do you think of the rise of the neo-Nazis in the United States today?
It makes me weep. Anybody seen Black Klansman, the movie Black Klansman? It's a good movie, but at the end of it, and I didn't know it was coming. At the very end of the movie, they show video from the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, and the neo-Nazis with the Nazi symbols, and the guys with the tiki torches yelling, "Jews will not replace us." And I could barely get out of my chair. The idea that there are people in the United States who think that's a good idea makes me crazy. And so, I mean, it's all of our responsibility. We have to work for sanity. We have to work for justice where we see it. We can't do what the Germans did and outlaw it, right? We have the First Amendment. We can't outlaw political speech, but we can oppose it. Yeah.
I'm just curious, do you know anything about in Germany, the population of the Jewish people now?
I don't know numbers. There certainly is a Jewish population, and the same in Vienna. There are people who went back after the war. I knew she's passed now, but I knew a Jewish woman in Vienna who had been sent away to the United States by her family. But she was there at the beginning, right? You know how in the stories you hear about the Nazis, they have the Jewish people like on their knees scrubbing the cobblestones with their toothbrushes. She did that when she was a kid before they sent her off to the United States, and she went back and had a career basically as a teacher of English in Vienna after the war. So there are Jewish communities there, and people like Susan Neiman, the author of the book, A Jew Who Moved Back There. And she said that she couldn't have done it in 1982. She didn't think it was any place for a Jew in 1982. But by the time she moved back in the 21st century, she felt comfortable doing that. So there's been change in that.
I had a dear friend who has passed, but he was evacuated from Vienna and sent to St. Louis as a 13-year-old, and then served in the American Army during World War II. He had two aunts who survived.
Oh, excellent.
One went to Switzerland, and she stayed there, and she would never go back to Germany at all. The other one went back to Vienna on vacation. And for anyone who doesn't know, the Soccer Hotel is the most famous, most prestigious hotel in Vienna. And she always relished going back and staying at the soccer and making sure that everyone had to serve her properly.
Absolutely, man. That's great. You can tell I like movies. This isn't on the sheet. There's a wonderful movie that you might be able to get streaming now. It's called Vienna's Lost Daughters. And it's about women who evacuated and left and never went back. And most of them were from the New York City or New Jersey area. And the granddaughter of one of them was a filmmaker, and she convinced her grandma and some of her grandma's friends to go back. And she took these women back to Vienna and filmed it. And it's a wonderful movie. I saw it in Vienna actually, but it is available. It's a little bit hard to find. Vienna's Lost Daughters. Yeah, it's a documentary.
And it's part of what prompted this course. A year ago, my wife and I took an Elbe River cruise and Hamburg and we stopped in Berlin and Dresden and Wittenberg. And what really spoke to us was this sentiment, the attitude of the Germans, that clearly they were dealing with their role in the war in a very healthy way. And that's why thought it'd be a good idea to put a course like this together. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so very much for teaching.
Well, yeah, I'm glad. And there is pushback, right? There's the new German far right party, Alternative for Deutschland, that's basically anti-immigrant, populist, racist. And they've got more support than I like to see in Germany. It's the first far right party that's been in the German government since the war.
Tell us a little bit about your experience in the classroom. I realize you may not teach a class that has this name to it, but if you compare to 1968 in Germany and the young people they became involved, and today's young people and what they are interested in and what their experience is as well once they go through this kind of a learning experience in the classroom and so forth. Tell us a little about your experience of how students react to this topic.
Well, of course, they're very, very interested in it. I do teach a course in the Holocaust. And I teach another course on genocide in general. I tell you, it's not a happy course. By the halfway through the semester, I have to bring ice cream. But when I first came to Hope in the 90s, I was teaching a Western Civ course, right? Second half in the biz, right? We call it Plato to NATO. But I was only teaching the second half, so Reformation on up through the Second World War and post. And so I said, well, of course I'm gonna teach the Holocaust, and I'm gonna use survivor literature, and I used Elie Wiesel's book Night, which some of you may have read. And I was horrified. It was only 2 students, but still, I was horrified by students who wrote that if only the Jews had converted to Christianity, they wouldn't have had such trouble. And I mean, a couple of things. The Nazis didn't care if you converted to Christianity. If you had more than one Jewish grandparent, you were Jew. The second thing, I mean, like, you mean like Hitler was the instrument of God? And my students said, yeah. And I'm like, so I decided that I wasn't only going to teach victim literature anymore. And so when I teach this stuff, I do perpetrator documents. Like I talk about the law and about how the Nazis built the Holocaust step by step and inch by inch, and made it into a legal structure, and even walled it off. So even they knew at the time, like they weren't going to talk about this publicly. And so when I do it now, I do more about how it happened. And of course, the voices of the victims are important. And when I teach Holocaust, I do both. But if I have to choose, if I can only do one thing, I do perpetrator documents, because it's much harder to say that this is the instrument of God when you read how they did it. And I have to say, that was 2 students. It was a long time ago. It hasn't happened since. But I haven't approached the subject in the same way since either. So students are very, very interested in this. Yeah.
In Susan Neiman's book, could you tell us, does she speak to this issue? Would teaching children, their own children, in the family's children, be part of what the whole country is trying to complete? We understand that things are illegal and unacceptable and antisocial, but would families play a role in any of this learning?
Well, yes, I think since 68, right? Before 68, one of the things the students were upset about was that their families weren't talking about it. They couldn't get answers out of their families and they couldn't get answers out of their schools. But one of the things that resulted from 68 was a wholesale reformation of the teaching curriculum. And so the kids in 68 became the parents, right? In the 70s and the 80s. And so, yes, we don't have the same problem with family silence anymore. Now, I don't have any personal knowledge about like, what did you do in the war, Daddy? Like, I don't know if you have somebody who was basically a war criminal. I don't know if your family talks about that. I don't have any information about that. But yes, people do talk about it now. It's not just in the schools.
Any other questions?
Have you ever read the book In the Garden of Beasts by Eric Larson? Because I think that gives a real good view of what was going on in the early 1930s in Germany. And then obviously the movie Cabaret gives a good indication of the decadence,
Yeah.
what was going on in Germany and stuff. And that I think helps give you a better perspective of what created all this, what, was going on and stuff.
Yeah, In the Garden of Beasts is a really good book. The author is Eric Larson. It's about the American ambassador to Berlin and especially about his daughter in the 30s. And it's nonfiction. It's a good book. And I love Cabaret. I mean, obviously romanticized, but I love Cabaret. Liza Minnelli, Joel Grey, what's not to like?
Give Dr. Gibbs another hand. Thank you very
All
much.
right. Thank you. Thank you all for coming.